Right, fantastic. I think we'll get going just because of the very conscious of the time and just running over. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Staffordshire Chamber of Commerce webinar today. My name is Laura Hodgkiss, and I'm the event and training team leader here at Staffordshire Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's quite a beautiful day today, so thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is COVID-19 business support and recovery options with our panel of experts, which is Bob Young, Diane, Dunion, and Michaela, Daly. So we're really excited to have them here today. So just a couple of ground rules before we get started. We can't see you today, but you can participate with the webinar today. So there are several ways that you can do that with us. So those of you that have never used Zoom before, there is a chat function and a QA function just at the bottom. So if all of you that are attending, you could just say a quick hello in the chat function down at the bottom, just so I know it works, that'd be absolutely fantastic. You can also put your questions, by the way, today in the Q&A section as well at the bottom. Can everybody see the brilliant? Fantastic. So I know that people are using it. Yeah, if you could just say hello in the chat function at the bottom, that would be brilliant. Brilliant, fantastic. Great. For those of you that want to talk to us and want to have sort of an interactive conversation, we will be taking live questions as well today. And the way that you can do that is just next to your name at the side. You will be able to raise your hand and we will be able to let you speak live to the panelists today. So first of all, before we get going with the pre-allocated questions that for today, I'm just going to ask my panel of experts to introduce themselves. So Bob, if you want to start us off today.
Hi Laura, hi everybody. Right, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob Young. I spent all my career in insolvency and turnaround work. Started off in the insolvency service, becoming the youngest official receiver in the High Court in 1983. Then I spent 10 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I was the director who opened the Stoke office for PwC. We then traded as Court Gully. But they were a bit big and bureaucratic for me, so in 1997, I left to set up my own firm, which I traded in Stoke, in Festival Park to start with, and then in Newcastle under Lyme, and then at Caverswell, which I sold after a number of successful years to Begbies Traynor in 2005. I was then the partner in charge of Begbies Traynor until 2015. And during that time, I've managed thousands and thousands of insolvency and turnaround assignments, saved some through insolvency processes, which I can name, some genuine turnarounds where people don't want me to name them. Some of the names you will be familiar with that I've dealt with, Wedgwood Museum, which I traded for 4 years as administrator, Goff & Co, Stoke's largest engineering firm at the time, and Port Vale twice. They loved it so much they came back for a second bite. I thought I'd managed to retire in 2016, but when Dunion's business was bought by Begbies Traynor, and Di asked me to come back, I couldn't resist it. I've known Di a long time. I think she's the best insolvency practitioner in Staffordshire, and so I jumped at the chance, and I'm now back working part-time with Begbies and thoroughly enjoying it. I'm also an NED of the Hanley Economic Building Society.
Brilliant, fantastic, Bob. Thank you so much. Diane, if you want to go next.
Okay, thank you. Morning, everybody. It's Diane Dunion. My career in insolvency started in 1990. I worked for 10 years with the Insolvency Service, the Official Receiver's Office in Stoke. I then joined the private sector. I went to work with Phil Wood at Barrington's, now BCR, Barrington's Corporate Recovery, where I qualified as an insolvency practitioner in 2002. For three and a half years, 2005 to 2008, I worked in Manchester, working on high volume individual voluntary arrangements. Before returning to Stoke in 2008, where I set up my own practice, Dunion & Co. I ran the practice for 10 years before selling it to Begbies Traynor in March last year. I had this wonderful opportunity to join a big corporate insolvency practice. Begbies have got over 70 locations nationally. excuse me, so I seized the opportunity, and I'm working now with Begbies, running the Staffordshire office with my team and Bob and Michaela and others.
Brilliant, Diane. Thank you very much. Michaela, you're next.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm Michaela Daly. I am the manager at Begbies Traynor in Staffordshire, working alongside Diane. I've been in insolvency now for just over 20 years. I qualified as an insolvency practitioner in 2007. I started off life at KPMG and then went on to PKF and gained, experience there before joining Bob Young, prior to him selling his firm to Begbies, and worked there from 2005 until I think it was about 2015. At which point I sort of left, took a break, and started my own firm in 2017 for a short period of time before Diane gave me an opportunity to come back to Begbies, which of course I couldn't do anything but snap up. So yeah, that's me really.
Wonderful, fantastic. Thank you, Michaela. Brilliant. So it's great to hear from our panel of experts today. So we're going to go through some pre-questions that we've had in, just to talk about those first of all, and then we'll open it up to you as the attendees just to go through some live questions with you today. So the first question, and Bob, I'm going to pop to you if that's okay. So the question is from David Wright of Thompson Wright Chartered Accountants. When the economy does eventually start to recover from COVID-19 pandemic, what shape of recovery would you expect, and how do you think the recovery will look post pre-COVID levels?
Right, I might have known David would ask a difficult question. That's quite a big question. I mean, is it going to be a V shape? Is it going to be a U shape? Is it going to be a 90 sort of tick and a slow incline? There are as many forecasts as there are economists, I think. I think the best forecast, I think, at the moment is from the OBR. And that's largely because they've got access to more data than anybody else. And they're forecasting a drop in GDP in Q2 of 35%, which is just astonishing. And it's worse in manufacturing. They're forecasting a drop of 55% in manufacturing. They are also forecasting something of a bounce back and a drop of GDP in the year 2020 of only 12.8%. Some people have put it much higher, a few have put it lower. Now, I do think this is going to be very different from the recovery from the 2008 sort of financial crash. I think after that, you remember George Osborne was constantly taunted by Ed Balls in the Commons about flatlining. I don't think we're going to see that. I think there will be a recovery, and I think it will be quick. I think there will be some fairly spectacular gains in GDP to restore most of the losses that we've seen. But any post-lockdown recovery will be from a lower base. And some sectors will be slower to recover than others. And I think the impact of this recession, although it'll be a sharper recovery than after the financial crash, the impact will linger. The National Institute of Economic and Social Research, in its latest quarter review, forecast growth in Q3, and it's not too precise about how much, but they go on to forecast, more interestingly, growth of 6.8% GDP next year in 2021. I think that's probably quite a prudent forecast, won't restore all of the losses that we're going to see this year. And they're forecasting that the economy won't get back even to 2019 levels until late 2021. So that implies that coronavirus has cost us 2 years of growth, and that's assuming we don't have, that it doesn't get worse. So even by 2024, if you look at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research forecast, they're saying the economy will be £16 billion smaller than in previous quarters. I'm no economist. I'm very interested in it. I read what lots of economists are saying. My favourite economist is David Smith, and he writes regularly for the Times. And he says there will be a V-shaped recovery, but the upside won't be quite as sharp as the downside, and it will be shallower. I mean, he's produced a very good graphic. I don't know whether you can see it on here, but you can see the top line is the line of the old projection, and you can see this V-shaped recovery, but then going not flatlining, but coming the recovery being lower and shallower than it would have been. It doesn't get back to pre-corona virus levels for quite a while. Now, certain sections will suffer more than others. Obviously, international travel firms, airlines. I most certainly wouldn't want to be a travel agent at the moment. But there will be winners as well. I think when we can eventually go away, I think there'll be a lot more staycations. I think campsites will do very well this summer in the UK. I think there will also be some reshoring of manufacturing business, because the weaknesses in the international supply chain, the just-in-time processes that many firms have been very good at, those are going to be not quite as slick as they were. So I can see some reshoring of manufacturing. I hope so, because I think that'd be very good for our area, where we still do have quite a big manufacturing sector. I think it will lead to higher unemployment. I think once the furlough scheme ends, I think there will be a lot of redundancies. And so I think there will be a government stimulus in the short term. I think they may even reduce taxes to try and stimulate the economy, and I think that's likely to help. If you think of all the stimulus they did after 2008, that actually worked pretty well. It stopped mass insolvencies. But after that short-term stimulus, inevitably, we're going to have debt to GDP exceeding 100%, which is astonishing when you think, as recently as 2008, I think we had debt to GDP of 40%. So we've got, compare it like a household mortgage, we've now got a 100% mortgage rather than a 40% mortgage. We've got less money to spend, we've got to spend more on repayments. And those repayments are us and our children paying more in tax for many, many years to come. That will have a dampening effect on the economy. There will be less money to spend. So I do think growth will be slower. And I think as well, there'll be an impact on global trade in the short to medium term. And I'll wrap up by saying a world with less global trade will be poorer than a world with more global trade. And it's not doom and gloom, we'll recover, but it won't be quite as good as before.
Brilliant, Bob. Thank you for that. Very insightful, actually, especially with that graph as well. Just gives it a good context of what you're talking about there. Next question to Diane, if that's okay, Diane. Question is from the Hanley Economic Building Society. How do you think the CBIL programme of the help of SMEs has been handled? And do you think the scheme will help companies to weather the crisis?
Okay, well, the CBIL programme is, I'm sure everybody who's listening to this webinar will be aware of what it is, but I will just explain. It's the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme. And it's one of the many government funding initiatives that's been introduced to basically deal with businesses in crisis, and also employees who've been furloughed and sole traders. They've got their self-employed grants being paid out soon as well. But the CBILs, it's loans for between 250,000 and 5 million. Now, this is for businesses, and businesses do have to meet certain criteria, and that criteria is the business has to be based in the UK, annual turnover up to 45 million. So if they're part of a group, even if that's in another country, if the annual turnover is more than 45 million, then they don't meet the criteria. The business has to demonstrate that it would be viable if it was not for the pandemic. So basically, if businesses are going to apply for CBILs, then they're going to have to produce accounts, figures, cash flow forecast, profit and loss. The amount of information that they will have to produce will depend entirely on the loan, the amount of loan that they are applying for. Obviously, the higher the loan, the more they'll have to demonstrate that the business is viable in terms of historic accounts and forecasts going forward. They have to show that the business has been adversely affected by the virus, by the pandemic. So in other words, that the business wasn't in trouble beforehand. And many of them will have to produce accounts to show that they were viable as at the 31st of December 2019. So, you know, 2.5 months before, well, just over 2.5 months before we went into lockdown. When the scheme was initially introduced, it was only available to businesses if they were not able to get, if they didn't qualify a loan from the bank under the normal parameters. But the criteria is now being extended, so basically any business can now apply for it. Depending on how much you want to borrow, the approval can be almost immediately. So the lower the amount you want to borrow, the turning around these loans and getting the monies out there to struggling businesses within 24, 48 hours. The more you want to borrow, the more you've got to demonstrate that your business is viable. You know, they've got to do the due diligence the lenders have and so on and so forth. So it could take up to 2 weeks, but typically between 2 days and 2 weeks. Some of them, the smaller amount, almost instantaneous. No personal guarantees are required from the directors of the companies who are applying for the loans if the loan is less than £250,000. And there's no repayments in the first 12 months. So you can put the repayments over 5 years with the 12 months that's free, the first free, well, not free exactly, sorry, but no repayments in the first 12 months. It then to actually extend the loan to 6 years, so 72 months, but the first 12 months you're not paying anything. So repayable for up to 5 years. If you pay it back earlier, then the interest rate is lower, but the interest rate is typically 3.49% to 3.99%. I understand that the take-up in Staffordshire for these loans has been very, very high. I understand that they've had numerous applications and the vast majority have actually been approved. And some of the banks have set up sort of triage units, special units, you know, manned with specialised staff to deal with these applications as they're hitting the banks. Because obviously, if you've got a business in trouble, you don't want to be waiting 6 weeks to A, to know whether you're going to get the money, and B, for it to be approved. People need this money straight away, and the banks are on board with this and have set up specialised units. And then, of course, we've got, you know, in addition to CBILs, we've also got the bounce-back loans. I don't know if you want me to just mention the bounce-back loans, because the bounce-back loans are for lower sums, from between 2k and 50k. And you can apply for up to 25% of the company's turnover, the business turnover, up to 50,000. The bounce-back loans are 100% government-backed. The CBILs are 80% government-backed. Again, with CBILs, the bounce-back loans, there's no payments due in the first 12 months. Approval is very quick. Because of the lower amount compared to the CBILs, there's no personal guarantees required with the bounce-back loans. Interest rate 2.5%, and there's no fee to access the scheme. So I think with those two initiatives, funding initiatives for struggling businesses, I have to say, I think the government worked very, very quickly. They addressed the issue in the business community very, very quickly. And I think there is, providing you had a viable business before lockdown, before the pandemic, you know, the impact of that hit businesses, then I think there are you know, a number of initiatives out there that will help businesses through this difficult period. Thank you.
Brilliant, Diane. Thank you. Really appreciate that. So the next question is for you, Michaela. So apart from the new government schemes, what restructuring and insolvency options are there for businesses to help them survive?
Right, well, there are options out there for businesses that are struggling at the moment. And what I'll do is I'll just go through the options available in a sort of brief format for you. One of the options is a CVA, which is a company voluntary arrangement. And this is essentially a legal binding agreement between the company and its creditors. A CVA typically lasts for 5 years and is usually on a monthly voluntary contribution basis. But it can be based around all sorts of things like the sale of assets. This can be used as a technique to restructure a business. A CVA can be a solution particularly for companies that are struggling under the burden of debt, but they still have a viable business going forward. One of the advantages to a CVA is that the management of the business remains in control, so obviously the directors still run the business. There has to be 75% of value of voting creditors, though, to agree to the arrangement for it to be approved. But once approved, all creditors, except for your secure creditors, are bound by the arrangement. So it's a good option if you've got a viable business going forward that just needs a bit of a break from the burden of the debt it's got at the moment. There's obviously the option of administration. The administration process creates a moratorium over the company, which means that all legal action against that company ceases. So that can be quite a useful tool in the situation as is. A company can actually trade in administration if the right circumstances. You usually have to have some sort of funding. I mean, most people associate trade and administrations with like football clubs. And it's kind of that sort of thing. It can be that you need to trade for a certain period of time to sell the business as a going concern. And it also, the image of the company in respect of business brand name is unlikely to be compromised, so it can actually keep its value. And in certain instances, you can actually trade through an admin and exit through the CVA process. And again, putting control back in the director's hands or the owner's hands. A lot of people have already heard of the pre-pack administration, which is when the company goes into administration on that day and the sale of the business is the same day. Again, the main criteria for a pre-pack administration is that it must be the best interest of creditors as well as those of the company. It also has to be very transparent of the reasons of why pre-pack, which is why it's had bad press in the past, and that's why SIP 16 has been introduced, so that creditors know exactly what's going on. It also allows the sale of a business as a going concern. It also allows the company, if you've got one part of the company that's just not making money and another part that actually is viable, you could just sell the viable part of the business so that there's something there going forward. And the whole point of these is that hopefully that you save jobs, and also the suppliers will have a continued customer going forward with regards to the new company. There's also instances, obviously, where you can get an insolvency practitioner to actually just go in and review your business. Because directors and shareholders can sometimes be so emotionally involved with their own company that they just can't see where costs could be cut, whereas a fresh pair of eyes can actually go in there and just give you a business review and say, actually, is this really making money? Or do you need to really look at restructuring it in some sort of way so that going forward it is more viable? And they're the main sort of restructuring tools. Obviously, there's certain points where for a company, there's just those options just aren't available, and then you're looking at sort of like the liquidation scenarios, and obviously you can compulsory liquidation through the courts, and then you've got your creditors voluntary liquidation, which we're more than happy to help with. But if you're in that sort of situation, the main thing I would say is just seek advice and find out what your options actually are, because obviously I've just gone a very brief of what's available. You've got to hit certain criteria, and you need to speak to somebody really about that.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Brilliant. Thank you. Bob, next question for you. What sectors, I know that you've already touched on this briefly, sorry, this question. What sectors are hurting most, and are there issues that are affecting Staffordshire particularly badly?
Yeah, I think there are. Before I answer that, just sort of want to reinforce what Michaela was saying about take advice. You can't, if you're struggling in business at the moment, take advice, preferably from us, but there are other professional advisors out there. A lot of the accountants and lawyers are pumping around information on newsletters at the moment, and many of them are very good. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone or send an email and ask for advice, because it is easier for an objective third party, a professional, to see the wood for the trees. Right, moving on to your question. Sectors, well, I mean, we're struggling in Staffordshire in the same way as most of the country in terms of sectors. Travel, leisure, anyone who supplies to airlines or airports. The hospitality industry has been absolutely decimated for the moment, and The furlough scheme has been magnificent in keeping people employed, so that when factories and pubs and so on can reopen, they'll still have some staff to do the job. So they're probably the worst sectors. I think in Staffordshire as well, manufacturing, we still have quite a big manufacturing base, and we have a lot of smaller manufacturers and smaller engineering businesses that supply the likes of Bentley, JCB and JLR. And they must be really hurting at the moment, because the first thing those big manufacturers have done is cut back all their contracts with their subcontractors and their suppliers. So I think for Staffordshire, that is a particular problem. On the leisure side, Staffordshire is also particularly affected. We sometimes don't realise this because we're a long way from the seaside, but we've got Alton Towers, one of the biggest tourist resorts in the country, Drayton Manor, even Trentham Gardens. Millions of people come and visit these things every year. They're not open. And the suppliers to those businesses are really, really going to struggle. We've also, of course, got a very high proportion of pubs. I recall one of the many pubs I've handled in insolvency and actually turned around. Most of them we have turned around as well. Marston's were a brewery in one case, and Marston said, "Oh, we hate it because Staffordshire's the best part of the country, in particular Burslem. We sell more beer here than we do in most parts of the country." So the breweries will have a vested interest in supporting these pubs to get back up and running. And I'm hoping they'll be a bit more friendly than they usually are with the levels of rent and what they charge barrelage for the beer and so on. But we do have a lot of suppliers to the big manufacturers. So I think Staffordshire is probably quite badly affected. On the upside, of course, manufacturers of toilet rolls have done brilliantly. And also hand wash. I think supermarkets, corner shops, pharmacies have actually all done very well. So it's not all doom and gloom. And online retailers have done fantastically well. And, you know, when we get to the new normal, to quote a phrase everybody's talking about, I think we will see far more business going online and far more remote working. Because people have got used to it. I mean, you've seen Diane in her magnificent office in her garden that she's built, and it actually works very well on Zoom and so on. Finally, on Staffordshire, I'd like to say I believe I've been working here for 20 years, and I've become a Stokie. I believe Staffordshire is far more resourceful than many other areas of the country. If you notice in recessions, and I've worked through quite a lot, Staffordshire never suffers as badly in a recession. We perhaps don't do quite as well in the booms. But whereas other areas of the country sort of do this, we tend to do this. And I think because of that resourcefulness, we will recover better. We do adopt better. People will repurpose their businesses. We're already seeing repurposing for people who used to manufacture something else, now manufacturing gowns or masks or hand wash and things for the health service. So there is this resourcefulness here. We also have a very good chamber. And many of you will have seen our chief executive, Sarah, on the television last night on BBC Regional News. Excellent as usual. Promoting the local community. We have got one of the best chambers, one of the most vibrant chambers in the country, and that reflects the very vibrant number of small businesses we've got. So longer term, I think we'll be okay.
Well, thank you, Bob. Next question to you, Diane. Are landlords being sufficiently accommodating to their business tenants?
Okay, Laura. Right, well, in terms of commercial premises and commercial rent, I think the view generally out there is that, you know, everything's sort of on the landlord side and the tenant, you know, tenant is generally the one to suffer. However, in 2014, legislation was introduced. We refer to it as CRAR, C-R-A-R, and basically that gave the tenants more rights, if you like, when they were in rent arrears and the landlord was trying to collect. So it's all that, the whole legislation is around the recovery of commercial rent arrears. where the landlord has to, under that legislation, has to give one week's notice before basically, you know, if there's rent arrears, 1 week's notice, or he's going to wade in there, or she's going to wade in there. In response to the pandemic, the government introduced secondary and emergency legislation in April, just last month, just 3 or 4 weeks ago. And basically that was to ease the situation for the tenants if they were in rent arrears. And basically what it did was to increase the minimum amount of rent, which has to be left unpaid, up to 90 days before recovery action can be taken. So it's made things a little bit easier for the commercial tenant who's in rent arrears. Now, the rent arrears has to be due, you know, as a direct impact of COVID-19. So yesterday I spoke to a mate of mine, Colin Naylor. He owns Duke's Bailiffs based in Staffordshire. So Colin, as you can imagine, as a local bailiff company, they do work outside of the area as well, a lot of work outside of the area, but they act for a number of landlords. And he said to me that his clients are being very, very accommodating in as much that they're granting rent breaks and payment holidays. So the landlords are working with the tenants. I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, you know, if the landlord's going to fall out with the tenant and take steps to evict the tenant for non-payment, then ultimately they're going to end up with an empty property, which they don't want. And I think just touching slightly on what Bob's just been talking about and what businesses are struggling at the moment, my view is, as is the view of a lot of people, of course, that going forward, one of the businesses, you know, industries that's going to suffer is your commercial landlords, because we've, you know, a big part of the population, you know, the majority of the population, if they are able to work at home, we are now comfortably working at home. Here I am in my little garden studio, as Bob would point out. This was not actually built to be an office. It went in on the 25th of February and it was going to be a nice little garden building for me. It has now become my permanent office. And it was very fortuitous that it went in at that time, because it's been absolutely brilliant. So I think certainly in the short term and maybe the medium term, even though Boris's message on Sunday was, well, at best a bit ambiguous, at worst it was bloody confusing. It was stay at home or go to work. Okay. But certainly for, you know, the social distancing is going to continue for a while. Begbies as an employer, I know for a fact, will make sure that all the right processes are put in place for you know, our staff to return to work safely. So I cannot see, and there's only 4 in our office, I cannot see for the next few months there being 4 in our office at any one time. So we've got to social distance. So in terms of people working at home and the impact it's going to have on commercial landlords, obviously to get back to the question, I think you know, in the next, you know, few months, stroke years, it's going to have a massive impact on commercial landlords. So commercial landlords do want to be as accommodating as they can be now with their tenants. Basically, the story I got from Colin was that they want to work. We're all in this together. The whole, you know, the whole of the country is in this together. So the landlords want to work with the tenants. They want to work with them, make it as, you know, as comfortable for them as possible now, and obviously review the situation when we get to the end of the pandemic, whenever that may be. I also spoke to another, a chartered surveyor, Glenn Hammond. Many of you will know him. He's also a managing agent for commercial properties, got his own portfolio of commercial and residential properties as well. And he has said the same, that the landlords are working hand in hand with the tenants and giving payment breaks. Some of the tenants are using the grant, the 10 grand grant that they've received, the small businesses, in order to pay rent. Some landlords are giving payment breaks. One particular landlord who's got rather a large, one of the large local charities as his tenant, has actually agreed 6 months rent free with that particular charity. And we all know that charities are struggling, you know, as much as anybody, and more than you know, a lot of other businesses and industry. So this particular landlord has granted a 6 month rent-free period. It is on the basis they extend the lease for 6 months, but he has actually given 6-month rent-free period that won't be added on at the end, even though the lease will be extended, you know, if it's agreeable. But that's equivalent to £25,000. So yes, in you know, the short answer to the question, yes, landlords are being perhaps more than sufficiently accommodating, but obviously landlords are also looking to the future to see what impacts, you know, the outcome of the pandemic is going to have on their commercial rental income.
Wow, brilliant, Diane. Thank you very much. Michaela, just the next question for you. The government has said that they will suspend the wrongful trading rule. What does this mean in practice?
Right, just for anybody that doesn't know, prior to the announcement, wrongful trading provision provides protection for creditors by imposing a personal liability on directors for an insolvent company that continues to trade beyond the time which there is no reasonable prospect of the company avoiding insolvency. Therefore, the aim of the suspension is to allow directors to continue trading distressed companies affected by COVID-19 without the risk of personal liability. In practice, what does this mean? Well, it means that directors can carry on trading through, knowing that they are insolvent, if they think there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that they can get some credit, get the loans, whatever, to actually continue trading through without that worry, as it were, that at the end of it, if it doesn't pan out and the company does end up insolvent, they won't have that personal liability. So it gives them a bit more leeway, as it were. However, again, I can't stress enough that if you find yourself in that position, then you should be talking to your accountants anyway, or an insolvency practitioner, to see if there is other options available to you. And also just to remind people that directors, even though you've got the suspension, you've still got your fiduciary duties to do. And an insolvency practitioner, if you do go insolvent, still has the requirements to report on your conduct. So just make sure that you record everything, why you're making these decisions, why you're continuing to trade, because although you have got that suspension of that one particular part of wrongful trading, there are other things that could trip you up as a director. So again, my advice is always to go and seek professional advice if you find yourself, and there could be another insolvency option, a restructuring option available to you. So go talk to somebody.
Brilliant, thank you so much for that. And just the final question for you, Bob, before we go to live questions. Am I right to think, sorry, this is from David Wright again, am I right to think that there is a big take up on bounce back loans, followed by a lot of businesses for insolvency practitioners next year?
Right, that's David tongue-in-cheek, isn't it? I think he's trying to make out that we insolvency practitioners do far better than general chartered accountants. There definitely will be an increase in insolvencies, personal insolvencies and corporate insolvencies, unfortunately. And I know everyone thinks insolvency practitioners love that. We don't really. We like saving businesses. And we're geared up to a certain level of trade. And it's very difficult to cope with 2, 3, 4 times the volume that we've currently got. It takes a long time to train up good insolvency people like Michaela, who I remember helping to train years ago. So it's not great for us either, but we cope by working longer, and a bit like the NHS are doing at the moment. Now, I don't think we're going to see in the short term a vast increase in business insolvencies, simply because people are rightly using the government schemes. They're furloughing their staff. They're taking advantage of the grants where they can, the business rates holiday, and the bounce back loans, the stuff that Diane was talking about, the CBIL loans and so on. I think the problem's going to come 6 months, 12 months down the line. And I think we as insolvency practitioners will be much busier next year than we're going to be this year. When you think about it, from what we've said in the answers we've all given so far, there's likely to be a lower level of trade going forward, even after we've recovered. And at that time, when businesses have got a lower level of trade, they've got to start repaying these loans, whether they're bounce back loans or the CBILS loans or whatever. They may have deferred their VAT, which they're allowed to do at the moment, and their PAYE. The revenue have been very helpful with time to pay schemes, but all that's doing is pushing back the date these things have to be paid, and they will have to be paid along with what are then new current liabilities at a time when businesses are likely to have a lower income. And so regrettably, I do see far more insolvencies next year or in the next year and maybe longer. So again, just to reiterate the very good advice Michaela gave, please talk to us or your preferred insolvency practitioner or your accountant or your lawyer who can direct you to a good insolvency practitioner with a view to getting the advice as to how hopefully to avoid insolvency. And if you can't, using these processes, come out of the other end of it with a viable business, perhaps by having written off some debt in the meantime through one of the processes. But we are now, all government insolvency legislation is geared to rescue, not burial. And we're very proud of doing that. And I think that whilst increased insolvencies will happen, it doesn't need to be terminal for most businesses.
Brilliant, Bob. Thank you very much. That was the last of the questions that have been submitted to us today. So thank you so much for answering those. So we are going to offer it out now to the attendees of the webinar today. So there are a couple of ways that you can communicate. You can either type your question in the Q&A or the chat at the bottom, or if you want to, just next to your name, raise your hand. Which you should be able to do near your name or at the bottom of the participant screen. And if you raise your hand, we'll be able to go to you live and get you to speak for your question. Sorry, I just coughed there slightly, just in the middle of my sentence, sorry. Yeah, so it's entirely up to you. So if I give you just a couple of minutes just to gather your thoughts and just see if there's any questions that you want to ask our panelists today. Just give you a couple of seconds because it does. Sometimes the Zoom platform's a little bit slow. Like I said, I'm quite happy to let any of the attendees talk if you should wish to ask a question directly. That's not a problem either. Everybody's very quiet today. Which is not a bad thing. It means that you've answered the questions, any questions that they did have when they first started the webinar. So let's just give you a couple, one more minute, just if anybody does have any questions or wants to ask any of the panelists any questions today before we leave.
Our details are made available to them, Laura, are they, if they want to email us directly or ring us directly? Yeah.
Absolutely. So at the end of the webinar, and for those of you that joined us maybe late or anything like that, we will have a live recording of this webinar on our webinar library anyway, and we'll just make sure all the details of the panelists today are emailed to you with your survey, just talking about the webinar and just seeing if you liked it today and you got all the information that you needed to. I don't think anybody's got any questions. Which is a first, actually, which is not a bad thing, like I said.
Laura, do you want me to sort of sum up then?
Yes, please, if you wouldn't mind, Bob, that would be fantastic.
If anybody wants to interrupt and ask a question at the end, that's fine. I mean, I'm not going to sort of repeat what we've already said. These are difficult times. We're here to help. We're not pariahs. If you give us a call, send us an email and want to just chat things through, it's good to have somebody to talk to. We're not going to force you into an insolvency process. We're not going to charge you money for talking to us for an hour or two and having a look at your business to see whether we can help direct you to any of the business support schemes, or whether we think an insolvency process is appropriate, whether you can restructure. So please do get in touch. If you look at there's a Begbies Traynor website that will appear at the end. But if you just look up Begbies Traynor online, we're the largest firm of insolvency practitioners in the country by the number of companies we rescue and turn around, or if we can't do that, a decent liquidation. Also on the website, we've got a very good COVID-19 business support guide, and I would encourage people to access that. So just click on Begbies-Traynor.com. Look on the front page for the COVID-19 business support guide. Click on that. You can download it or print it, and it gives you links to the various government schemes. And I know the Chamber's got lots of links to these as well. And if anybody wants to talk, please feel free to use me as a contact point. My email is bob.young@btguk.com. That's bob.young@btguk.com. And I think, Laura, that's about it. Can I just thank you, Sarah, as our Chief Executive, and everybody at the Chamber for everything you're doing to support businesses through this very difficult time.
Thank you so much, Bob. And it's been a pleasure to have you all here as expert panelists. And probably from my point of view, actually, I've probably learned a few things myself as well, which is always a good sign of a good webinar. So everybody that's attended, like I said, and we will make sure you get Bob, Diane's and Michaela's details at the end. And should you need anything, I'll just pass those over to you. But for now, thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.